Amen. You can be seated. Who'll be first tonight? Song, testimony, something on your heart.
I got to say that he told me, he said that I quit smoking. Now he's 76 and he has actually been smoking. I don't know how Mom and Dad let him do this, but he has been smoking since he has been like 13 or 14. A smoker. And, we've all talked to him, we've all prayed and said, you need to quit. My mom, before she passed away, every time she talked to him, she'd say, Larry, I wish you wouldn't smoke. He's had stents put in and all that. So he told me, he said, I went out the other day to smoke, because he doesn't smoke in the house, because my sister-in-law has some issues. And he said, I got ready to light it, and I said, it's New Year, and I'm going to quit smoking. And he said, I laid them down, and I haven't picked them up. So to me, that was a blessing. So now my prayer is going to be that he will be saved. Him and Vicki will be saved, but and I will pray for that. But I just went, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, I'm so glad. So he smoked a long time. So I figure if he can give that up, then we're hoping that he'll just, him and Vic will get in church and they'll both get saved.
Anybody else tonight? Song, testimony.
How many conversations all this weirdness has brought about what's important with God at the forefront, still continuing. Just glad to have been a part of any of that.
Mm-hmm. Next.
I think it's disgusting. And they were taking like ultrasound of my heart, and I could hear like the blood going with the pumping of it, and not like a heartbeat, like it was just so real sounding, and I just couldn't believe it. And I just thought how people could not believe that God created us, and how our bodies are so just, not from us, and just amazing, and just very wonderful that He created us. It's amazing.
Amen. Who's next?
hard. But I just thought how a baby, that their heart starts out so tiny and just turns in, to an adult heart, and it's just, I don't know, it just amazed me how God created all that, everything.
Blessings of God. The mysteries of God. Anything else tonight? Anybody else?
I'll let you mention it, but to see baby Emmett and Andrew and just how happy they are. I feel like that was just the other day for us. I think it was, but but I don't even know if I held a baby. I maybe held Penelope one time, but just it's good that there will be a kid that's raised in a good home. Just thankful for that. Yeah.
Love it. Anything else tonight?
All my heart. He takes care of me every day. I'm not very strong anymore. I don't work out or nothing since they closed the Life Center a year ago, just about. I'm getting off a week anymore. I don't exercise at all. Just sit in the chair all day. That's all I do. But I love him, and if it keeps up this, I'm going to get so weak I won't be able to get up and go. I know that's going to happen because I don't have nothing I want to do, other than go to church and go to the workout and things like that. Got to go pay bills, but it's going to get to where I ain't going to even able to get up and go. Because I have trouble now getting up out of the recliner, which a year or two ago I could just leap right out of it, and I can't do it now. If I did, I'd fall on my face or something, try to get up like I used to. And so I know I'm getting weaker every day, but as long as I can get out and go, I'm going to be in church. And when the doors open, if I'm able to do it, something might come up that I can't make it some once in a while, I just love the Lord, and I thank Him every day for blessing me so much. I love these little babies, but I'm so glad they belong to somebody else.
Oh, yeah.
Just grabbing this, grabbing that. They take the phone off and dial it, and I ain't used to that.
It's been a while, huh?
It bothers me a lot, So I love them all, but I'm so glad they belong to these. I can say amen to that.
Yeah. Anybody else tonight? If not, we're going to be in the book of Habakkuk for a while tonight. Habakkuk chapter number 3. Habakkuk chapter number 3. Toward the end of the Old Testament. 3-chapter book. Not many people are in very often. We're going to be looking at chapter number 3 tonight. And we are going to look at the entire chapter, 19 verses. but I promise, Kens, it won't take as long as you think it will, okay? Just relax for a little bit. Habakkuk chapter number 3. And as you're flipping, we're going to go ahead and have prayer over this study tonight. Father, as we come before you once again, God, we thank you just for the words that have been spoken tonight, the testimonies that have been given. God, we just thank you for your many blessings, and we just ask, dear Lord, that you go with us right now as we dig into your word, God, that we would feel your presence, dear Lord, that you would speak to us through your word tonight and just give us that seed of hope and encouragement to take root in our hearts, dear God, that we could apply to our lives. And we'll give you all the praise and honor for who you are. In your precious name we pray tonight. Amen. Habakkuk chapter number 3, beginning in verse number 1. And we are going to go ahead and read the entire chapter and then look at what we have to look at for this evening. So beginning in verse number 1, it says, Prayer of Habakkuk the prophet upon Shigionoth. O Lord, I have heard thy speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive thy work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years make known. In wrath remember mercy. God came to Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise, and his brightness was as the light. He had horns coming out of his hand, and there was the hiding of his power. Before him went the pestilence, and burning coals went forth at his feet. He stood and measured the earth, and he beheld and drove asunder the nations, and the everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills did bow. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, and the curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Was the Lord displeased against the rivers? Was thine anger against the rivers? Was thy wrath against the sea? And thou didst ride upon thine horses and thy chariots of salvation. Thy bow was made quite naked, according to the oaths of the tribes, even thy word, Selah. Thou didst cleave the earth with rivers. The mountains saw thee, and they trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered his voice and lifted up his hands on high. The sun and the moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of thine arrows they went, at the shining of thy glittering spear. Thou didst march through the land in indignation. Thou didst thresh the heathen in anger. Thou wentst forth for thy salvation of thy people, even for the salvation with thine anointed. Thou woundest the head of the house of the wicked by discovering the fountain unto the neck, Selah. Thou didst strike through with his staves the head of his villages. They came out as a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was as to devour the poor secretly. Thou didst walk through the sea with thine horses, through the heap of great waters. When I heard, my belly trembled. My lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered into my bones, and I trembled in myself, that I might rest in the day of trouble. When he cometh up unto the people, he will invade them with his troops. Although the fig tree shall not blossom, neither shall fruit be in the vines, the labor of the olive shall fail, and the fields shall yield no meat. The flock shall be cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he will make my feet like hinds' feet, and he will make me to walk upon mine high places, to the chief singer on my stringed instruments. And to be quite transparent with you tonight, I did not have a clear direction for this evening all week long. Until about this afternoon of studying and reading and looking over things at school in my free time, the Lord led me to the book of Habakkuk in chapter number 3. Now, in the entire book of Habakkuk, it's a discourse between the prophet and God. And in chapter number 1, the prophet Habakkuk is asking questions and almost having a question and answer session with God. He is wondering things and questioning some things that are going on. And so he asks those questions to God. And then in chapter 2, we see that God begins to speak to him and answer some of those questions. And then we get to chapter number 3, where he begins to speak to God once again. And in chapter number 3, he speaks to God in a spirit of prayer. And the whole chapter is almost just a prayer that he delivers unto God. And so it's a prayer that also imitates a lot of David's Psalms, where they are put to music and put to the stringed instruments and used as a song for the church. And so he writes this in the similar kind of manner that it would be used, as it is in the end of that verse, it is directed to the chief musician. And so he's writing it in that way that David really wrote the psalm, to be used as a song of the church, particularly of the Jews in their captivity. And so while they're awaiting deliverance, they would often quote and sing this song to give hope in that time. And as you begin to look at chapter number 3 of the book of Habakkuk, you begin to see some different types of things that are going on throughout this conversation and throughout this prayer. The very first thing that you begin to see in verses 1 and 2 is we begin to see a plea for revival. We begin to see a plea for the reviving of God's people. Begin to see a plea for just the spirit of revival to fall and settle upon the nations of God. And so we see in verse number 1 where he begins to speak, and he says that it's a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet upon Shigionoth. And so the first 2 chapters, as we've already said, are that question and answer session, time with God. And now God begins to answer him in this time of prayer that he's bringing before God in chapter number 3. And in verse number 2 of the chapter, he says, O Lord, I have heard thy speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive thy work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make known. And so Habakkuk opens up this prayer, this final pleading to God and this conversation with God. He opens it with this plea for revival. He knows how God once worked. He knows the things that God has done before in the past. He knows how God has delivered once before. And so he's pleading for a revival amongst the people of God and a working of God amongst the people, just as he has done in the past. He's pleading that God's people would respond how they once responded before. And he wants to see those actions happen again. He wants to see a turning to God. He wants to see a revival breaking out in the people of God. He wants to see the Spirit of God moving amongst his people once again. When you look at verse number 2 as this plea for revival and the thought behind Habakkuk's plea for this revival, we can see that as he begins to speak to this, we can see firstly that it shows that revival is a work of God and not of man. Man cannot drum it up. Man cannot schedule it up. Man cannot do those things, but instead it is an act of God. The only thing that man can do and should do and be doing frequently is just what Habakkuk is doing here in this chapter, and that is pleading with God, communing with God, marking up and getting serious about the fact that he is beckoning God to send revival. That is the job of man. That is our job as the children of God, is to plead and cry out to God, asking for that reviving work. Notice in his prayer, as he begins to say, revive thy work. Often we put ourselves at the center of these pleas. Often we put ourselves at the center of this request. We say, revive my work, or something about ourselves inside of that. And the only thing that really makes any sense is that we should have a heart and mind for God's work. For bigger, it's bigger than me and you. It's bigger than all of that together. It's not about us, but it's about the work of God. And so Habakkuk in this plea is beginning to recognize the fact that it's not about him, but it's more about the work of God and everything that has to do with the work of God, because revival only comes through the power of God. Spurgeon once said, "Shake off all the bitterness of everything that is with self or with party, and now pray, Lord, revive thy work, and if thy work happen to be more in one branch of the church than in another, Lord, give that the most reviving. Give us all the blessing, but do not let thine own purposes be accomplished, and thine own glory come of it, and we shall be well content, though we should be forgotten and unknown." Meaning that it is not about me and you, but it's about the work of God. And what should be well known is not about me and you and what we have accomplished, but what the Spirit of God has accomplished. And this also, as he's beckoning this revival, beginning this prayer, and that God would revive his work, he's also speaking to the fact that this has to be a personal prayer. This has to be a personal mission as well as a collective mission. Not only is it the fact that God can revive his entire church, but that should be that the Lord should revive me and you individually. We often blame the church for sin, corruption, laziness, prayerlessness, lack of spiritual power, or whatever, and often forget that we are in the church. We are part of the church. We are the church. And so with we being in the church as that body of believers, we should be thoughtful and mindful of the work of God and praying for that personal spiritual revival, that it begins here. That it begins in me, it begins in you. That should be the desire of us. And when we have that personal prayer, then it comes together as that collective revival spirit, and then God begins to accomplish what he set forth to accomplish. Diligently asking God that he be searching our hearts, and that we be searching our hearts, and having God putting his finger on things that we need to get rid of, that he might purge us of those things, and that we might be used of him. In verse number 2, he begins to say, "In the midst of the years, make known." Habakkuk longing for God to do a work so evident to everyone, praying that it be known in that definite time, in that definite place, that the Spirit of God would move so mightily that it would be recognized and that it would be felt. And then at the latter part of verse number 2, he says, "In wrath, remember mercy." And so in this prayer, he recognizes the fact that we don't deserve revival, but yet he prays that God bestow his mercy upon his people in sending revival power. How true that would be today. That in God's wrath, in pouring out God's wrath, he would remember mercy, and that he would bestow mercy upon his people and send revival. And then beginning in verse number 3 all the way to verse number 15, we have here what we see is the power of God on behalf of his people. And verse number 3 is more of the song that Habakkuk has written and that's went through, that would be recited and would be remembered in those times of need. Verse number 3, he says, "His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise." As Habakkuk spends his time in praying for that revival, he begins to praise the God who brings revival. And so in praying for revival in the midst of the wrath of God, he begins to praise God for the fact that he's going to bring it, even when he's not in it at that moment. And so in this song of praise, it's punctuated by the expressions of Selah, as in the Psalms, as bringing that moment of pause and reflection upon what God is doing. And so Habakkuk glorifies the power and the majesty of God. And this is really the type of praise that is needed amongst God's people, that we need to see more of in today's body of believers, is a praise that honors and glorifies God, a praise that declares the works of God, a praise that is teaching and reminding who God is and what God has accomplished, placing man in the perspective of under God, putting into perspective the power of God, building that confidence of faith in the power and the work of God, in glorifying God even in the midst of wrath for what God is going to accomplish. That's easier said than done. It's either easier said than done 9 times out of 10 when you're standing in the midst of your situation and not being able to see a way out. But yet, Habakkuk is laying forth that precedent that we should praise and glorify God for His power and His majesty for what He will do. Maybe not even for what He's currently doing. But praising Him because we know that He's at work, we just don't know what it might be, but yet we know He's going to accomplish it in the future. Perspective under the power of God, that we should have that perspective to see. Verse number 13, he says, Thou wentest forth for the salvation of thy people, even for the salvation with thine anointed. And so as Habakkuk begins to remember how God has saved in the past, it causes that faith in him to rise and swell as he begins to remember the goodness of God and the perspective that God has given that way out in the past, that God has given direction and redemption in the past, and He is going to do so now and in the future. And at the end of that, when he says, with thine anointed, he is pointing forward to the Messiah. Christ, as Christ would come and be that anointed, the anointed one that would bring salvation for His people. And then we begin to round out the end of the chapter with verses 16 through 18, where we begin to see the triumph of the prophet's faith, where he talks about the knowing of God's strength and how he can trust in God even in the midst of crisis, even in the midst of trouble, even in the midst of those situations, that he can cling to Him and know that God is God and that He is going to do what He said He was going to do. And even in the midst of crisis, he can still joy and praise because of who God is. In verse number 16, it says, When I heard, my belly trembled. Showing a response to the sovereignty of God. Recognizing His own weakness, recognizing His inferiority, and standing before God and realizing His majesty and His power. And in recognizing His majesty and His power, he's putting him in that place of understanding of who God really is and where God stands in correlation with His people. Verse number 16, he also says He will invade them with His troops. The prophet is remembering at this time that there still is a Babylonian invasion that is beginning to take place, that there is this invasion and takeover that is on the horizon. And as he's remembering this, he's also remembering the sovereign power of God and the majesty that He is using in directing this work. And what He is using to point God's people back to Him. It's in the time of pressing. It's in the time of redirection that God's people needed the change of perspective. You think about the many times that God allowed His people to be carried away into captivity, but then He led them to a place of redemption, led them away out of that captivity. I feel like we have the same thing occurring today. I feel like the words of Habakkuk still ring true today. Why? Because God's people, God's church, God's body has gotten complacent, comfortable, unmoved, and unworried. And God has really shaken the thoughts and processes of His people. And He's using these times for perspective, redirection, and understanding. Just as Habakkuk was speaking of the fact that there was a remembering of the sovereign power of God, so I pray that we have that understanding and remembrance of the sovereign power of God. Verse number 17 and verse number 18, he says, although the fig tree shall not blossom, neither shall fruit be in the vines, the labor of the olive shall fail, and the fields shall yield no meat, the flock shall be cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. So as he just said in verse number 16, talking about those troubles and trials that were on the horizon, talking about the invasion that was occurring and coming, he then begins to speak of an almost a vision-like process of seeing the Judean countryside desolate. Perhaps from the invasion of the Babylonians, perhaps from something else, but he begins to see this as a desolate place. And yet in the midst of almost complete loss and desolation, he then comes out in verse number 18. He talks about there being nothing in the stall. He talks about there being nothing in the field. He talks about the fig tree failing. He talks about there be no fruit on the vine. He talks about all of these things failing and there'd be desolation on every hand. Then in verse number 18 he says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. In the midst of almost complete loss, he can still rejoice in the Lord, knowing that God is not diminished just because of the circumstances and trials that he would face. Knowing that God is not diminished just because of what is occurring in the world. Knowing that God is still God, he is unchanged. And so instead of questioning God like he was in the beginning, he now sees that desolation as a chance to see the power and the might and the workings of God. And so even in the face of those desolate circumstances, he says that he can rejoice in the Lord because God is unchanging. The same God that had delivered in the past was going to be the same God that would deliver them then. The same God that delivered them then is the same God that can deliver us now from the troubles and trials that we face. But we have to have that perspective of understanding who God is and what God can accomplish. Then he rounds out his prayer in this chapter, in this book, with verse number 19, where he says, the Lord God is my strength, and he will make my feet like hinds' feet, and he will make me to walk upon mine high places. What he's talking about, that my hinds' feet, is almost like a deer, how a deer would walk and how they bounce about. And it's almost like they're joyful as they're fleeing from you, bouncing away. So he's saying that the strength of the Lord and the power of God and the majesty of God can make him walk like the deer trots. Setting him on places of mountaintops and places of victory. All because of the power of God. And so what we begin to see in chapter number 3, and what I hope you take away, if you didn't get anything else, you don't understand anything else, you didn't remember anything else, I hope we can look at the prayer of Habakkuk as the championing of who God is and what God can accomplish even in the midst of desolation. Even when we face troubles and trials in our life, knowing that those troubles and trials and that time of our life is really a redirection and a refocusing in on who God is. And even in the time when our world is in utter chaos, unrest on every hand, uncertainty all over the place, we can rest in the fact that God is assured that He is not surprised. He is not unknowing. But the power and majesty of God is still there, is still evident. And we can remember and understand who God is in that perspective and hold on to the fact that He is true and unchanging. And just as He was there with the Israelites in their captivity, just as He was there with them in drawing them back to redemption, I pray that God gives us that power and that path as well. That we as God's people will hold on to the fact through no matter what we face in life, that we will walk and cling close to Him, walk and strive after Him in everything that we do. I hope that made sense to you tonight. Sometimes it'll make sense to me, and then translation is a little bit different. But I hope that you get the understanding and the focus of what Habakkuk was trying to give in chapter number 3. Is there anything anybody wants to add? Any comments? Any thoughts that you have? Right. If not, I don't have any announcements at the time, except for coming up Saturday at 8 a.m. There'll be a work day out at Mount Hope, so make sure that if you can, go out there and take part in that and help out for a little bit. But what we're going to do to finish out the service tonight is I'm going to ask you, if you would, to stand with me. Those that would, that feel comfortable, we can gather around the altar. If not, you can lead out where you are. But what I want to finish out the service with is just prayer for us as a body of believers, for this congregation, that we would take hold of the fact that God is God, and there's a lot more that we need to do, and a lot more that God can accomplish with us. And we need to be receptive to that and ready for Him to move. And also just praying for our nation. Praying for everything that's going on in the world today. And that God would hold on to His remnant. Protect His remnant in this time of need. So feel free, if you want, gather around this altar and pray. Feel free to lead out where you are. But once you finish praying, you can be dismissed. We love each and every one of you, and we'll see you Sunday at 10 a.m. So feel free. Cece, if you wouldn't care to play something just quiet on the thing, and just lead out where you are, come to this altar and pray, and let's remember those requests tonight.